Hope everyone is doing well today. We are here to talk about inflation and where you could expect the markets to go from here for the duration of next year and the year that follows. Inflation that we are facing now is hardly anything in comparison to the inflation that occurred from 1973 to about 1983. You had interest rates which actually climbed upwards of 15%. You had stagflation, which began in the late 70s. And on top of that, at that time, you had a massive spending on armaments in the US, which is not being eclipsed now, even with all the aid that is going to Ukraine. You had infrastructure in the early 1980s in the US, which was beginning to fall apart also. So that was a strain on productivity when it's looked at for what it was. However, all this began to reverse in 1982, which we can now look back at and really mark as the change. And we have to look at the events which happened. And the main catalyst for inflation beginning to start to lose its claws at that point was the advent of the personal computer, which boosted productivity. Productivity, when it increases, has an anti-inflationary effect. And that continued through the 80s as PCs became more advanced. The IBM PC was introduced in August 1981, and by 1990, an entire industry had come up. If you were in the computer business back then, you could just look over the horizon and see what the potential was. In 1989, it seemed limitless. Even with the price of oil, which if you adjust even for inflation now, it was quite expensive for the 1980s. So when we look at a barrel of oil and everyone starts saying, oh, it's over $100, if you adjust the price of inflation, go back there, and you have oil at $30 a barrel in 1980, it's pretty much $120 a barrel now. So the price of energy was high for the period. And when you also look at the kind of gas economy cars gave back then, we could really say that oil was practically $180 a barrel back then. And this would really make sense if you look at the GDP of nations in 1980. You would see that Iran was in the top 10. And a lot of this had to do with the price of oil and, of course, the Shah of Iran being in power still. And, the nation not being under sanctions and being able to export oil freely. So when we go back and we look at inflation and we compare it to what we have now, in some ways, this is not as bad as them. And it also is very probable that this inflationary period is not going to last the way that period did beginning in 1968 with the easy cost of money and actually interest rate decreases throughout 1968 to then the entire 70s, where you basically saw interest rates going up and botched government policies all over the world in an attempt to control inflation, which was not going to happen because you can't control inflation when it's being driven up by energy costs. It's just not going to be possible by raising interest rates. All you can do is hope that you lessen demand, which eventually brings about a recession. And now you're back to lowering interest rates again as a federal bank or a central bank, and the inflation is still there. So that is the real risk here. Are we going to see that happen again? The likelihood of that is probably much lower this time, because it's a pandemic, of course, that's caused this inflation. So in a way, when the Federal Reserve had termed this as transient inflation, they probably were correct. What they were wrong about was that this transient inflation was not going to be over in a couple of months. It needs a couple of years to be over. So they're going to overshoot, as it's called, and induce a recession. How bad the recession is going to be, if you look at mathematical models, it's probably not going to be that bad. It's most likely going to be a shallow recession. The recession might be even more shallow if the war in Ukraine ends. The media is not paying much attention, especially in the West, to the fact that Russia has taken about 20% of Ukrainian territory at this point. And it's going to be hard for Ukraine to take it back without having long-range missiles and long-range weapon systems, which the West is not willing to provide Ukraine. So they're going to have difficulty taking that back. And, I'm not here to talk about the war in Ukraine in particular, because that's an entirely different geopolitical issue, which really I don't want to get into, as there are opinions on both sides which are very strong. But it is likely that the war in Ukraine will end by the end of this year. And if that happens, as I think it will, you will have a very shallow recession. And some economies won't have a recession at all, and growth will continue. If the war in Ukraine drags out, you will still have restrictions on the exports of Ukrainian fertilizer, Ukrainian wheat, and the cost of food will continue to stay elevated. And then in that case, the recession could be a bit deeper. Is it going to be the type of recession that we had in 2008? I don't think so. It's a different form of recession, but you will have inflation which lingers around, and either the emotional component of the market is going to have to deal with it, or the stock market is going to have a fall and end up staying there, like it did in the 70s, with bear rallies that come and then it gets knocked back down. So we are all in for a very turbulent 2 years if the war in Ukraine does not end. If the war does end, like I've suggested, then this recession will be over by the first quarter of 2023, and you could have the formation of a new bull market. Of course, there are going to be companies that are going to do well no matter what happens there. I think AMD, out of the semiconductors, will do well. Also, you can look at energy companies at this point. I would watch them because I think that they're in for a correction. I think once the energy market actually corrects, that could be a temporary bottom which could hold for the next 6 months. However, that correction has not yet taken place. So that's one thing I would watch. Another very important industry to watch is the auto industry. As supply issues begin to catch up, you should then see discounting coming back into the auto sector. In that case, then I would reevaluate the semiconductor space if you begin to see that. Because then, at that point, you could really call that the shortages are over. However, that doesn't seem to be happening yet. So there is still more demand than supply for semiconductor products, which bodes very well for companies like AMD and even Intel to a lesser extent. You could also look at healthcare. However, if you've lost money in the stock market, those sectors are not going to make your money back. You want something that could make your money back, you'd rather stick with semiconductors and energy once the correction happens. So those are my thoughts on this at this point.